Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I have the pleasure of convening this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. Our mission is simple but important: to advance both the research and the practical application of the concept of social capital. And we've been running this webinar series since 2020, bringing people together from around the world to share ideas and build connections. If you'd like to be part of that community, the association is always open and welcome for new members. We are honoured to be joined today by Professor Jimi Adams, a leading scholar whose work sits at the intersection of social networks, social structure, and the diffusion of ideas. Professor Adams is a professor of sociology at the University of South Carolina, and throughout his career, he has investigated how relationships among individuals and communities influence the spread of information, behaviors, and health outcomes across diverse populations, particularly in the United States and sub-Saharan Africa. His recent work focuses on identifying integrative patterns that bridge disciplinary boundaries, offering new clarity on how we conceptualize and study complex social processes. Professor Adams brings a unique combination of rigorous network analytic scholarship and deep engagement with real-world public health, demographic, and environmental challenges. He is an ideal guide for today's conversation on a unified conceptualization of social capital. Welcome, Jimi, and over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, that's interesting. I like the characterization of some of that. Interesting way to think about it. So this is the offshoot of a paper that was recently published with a grad student of mine and a collaborator from Barcelona. That I'm going to kind of tell the story of how this emerged as much as I am the content of what we ultimately published for a variety of reasons. So if you were familiar with, depending on how familiar you could be with my work, if you are quite familiar with it, you might be asking yourself why I'm the one talking about this in a number of ways. Because as Tristan noted, kind of a lot of my work has focused primarily on networks, social networks as a means for studying patterns of diffusion of things like diseases, behaviors, or ideas through populations. And I've had a secondary interest in connecting theoretical and methodological approaches to studying social networks. And those are the kind of two bends I'm probably most known for. And notice that social capital was not amongst the kind of first things I list there. However, as a social network scholar, something that happens, I think quite frequently, is we get requests for consultations on a wide range and number of projects in a variety of forms. And I would say for a good chunk of that my career, a lot of those requests have actually focused on social capital, with a strong assumption from some of those requests that network researchers all are interested in social capital in some form. And while for a long time I wasn't, I have become increasingly so as a lot of those requests came in. And in part, this reflected kind of a gap in some ways that I'm gonna kind of dive into in a little bit more later. But I want to caveat that to say that initially social capital is not really where I kind of come to this from, but I do come to this from a perspective that I think is brings a potential contribution there. And then I've been collaborating on this with somebody who is very much a social capital scholar. So hopefully she has kept us from saying anything completely off the mark as a result of that. But one of the things that characterized a lot of those early requests was the variety. I probably don't have to say this in this crowd, but the variety of definitions that exist about what social capital is at its core. And I'm not going to go through each one of these in any detail here, but I just have them here as a reflection of the kind of myriad ways that people have defined and thought about this from a variety of different perspectives. And I will come back to this kind of difference in a bit to try and kind of make sense of what we have attempted to do in our work on this. But something that seemed to happen a lot in the course of those consultation requests was an apparent confusion amongst folks in a number of ways. And in particular, it kind of frequently took the form of defining or conceptualizing or theorizing what social capital was with one definition or one set of definitions, and then measuring it and kind of evaluating it with another set. And a classic example of this that I can remember happening on more than one occasion was somebody basically saying that they were interested in studying social capital because of the ideas of somebody like James Coleman, who basically thinks that there's a particular network pattern, a network pattern of like cohesion, so people being well connected to each other, fostering social capital, and they wanted to study it for that reason. But then studying it with a measure that uses something like an idea from Nan Lin that uses what he refers to as like position generators of, do you have access to people who have certain skill sets or have particular characteristics? And those aren't in and of themselves, neither of them are problematic, but they really aren't capturing the same thing. And so if you're thinking that Coleman is why it matters to Coleman's version is why it matters to study capital, social capital, but then you're measuring it with Lin's approaches, they're really not kind of intersecting in key ways. And so what happened over the course of probably 10 to 15 years was I found myself trying to formulate what I thought was a characterization of what this kind of full field looked like as a whole. And this dovetails quite nicely with a project that I've had ongoing for a number of years now with my colleague Ryan Light, which Tristan summarized in some respects, of our project on the structure and organization of fields that involve many disciplines, and how those take shape over time. And in particular, this is a book project that's still very much in progress. It should be done by now, but isn't, where we're interested in kind of fleshing out the patterns and processes of what those kind of trajectories of boundary maintenance and crossing patterns across disciplines can look like over time. It has kind of a theoretical and an empirical hook to it. I won't go into the details of it, but I'll draw in a moment on some of the methods we've used in that work to kind of flesh out what we're doing in this kind of social capital space as well. So the book that we're working on, just by way of kind of filling that hole, is then takes those ideas and fills them out with a variety of case studies that are selected for a lot of reasons. But like I said, I want to draw on that work in particular here to kind of set the stage for how we started kind of diving into the social capital work on our end. And that is, we take the scholarship that exists on social capital and we build what's known as a citation network. Some of you may be familiar with, some may not, so forgive me if this is too elementary. But the basic idea is that you take a set of papers from the scholarship and you draw the connections between them based on citations. And the idea of a citation network is usually that the arrows follow the flow of information. So a paper that is getting cited sends information to a paper that is citing it. Like we learn from each other in that direction, you can think of. And then we can analyze those citation networks to locate what are known as communities amongst citation within this citation network. And basically, you see on the screen here kind of a network that is characterized by 3 different communities. And in each one of those communities, that's the kind of gray circles, most of the connections, or most of, in this case, the citations, are to other papers in that singular community, and very few of them go across this. So these are kind of communication silos, if you will, that are illustrated by citation patterns. And then what we're interested in doing once we identify these communities is think about the things that contribute to how those communities are structured, or what those communities mean for how people kind of know things or talk about things, et cetera. And so one way we can do this is ask the question of like, who is it that is potentially a key player in any one of these communities, right? So who's popular amongst these? And we can do this simply by counting citations and looking at the distribution of citations. And this can tell us something about who's important in this case, social capital literature, but not just social capital literature as a whole, but the separate communities of social capital literature. And then we can, on top of that, do what is known as we can build what are known as bibliographic coupling networks that ask not kind of just which papers are important or central or kind of carrying information more than others, but how do people jointly combine the ideas of multiple authors simultaneously? And this can start to tell us how we think about ideas as similar or dissimilar from one another inside a community. And if we do this in the way I've illustrated here in what are known as bibliographic coupling networks, it isn't just who I think is similar, but who we together think of as similar in building our ideas. So it becomes like a community idea, a community level idea of how different sets of concepts hang together in similar patterns. And so this was one of our first, and we can illustrate this with a series of kind of correlation type patterns that I'll talk really cursorily about in a minute. But that's the basic kind of analytic structure on top of those bibliographic coupling networks. So along with a former undergrad of mine who's now a PhD student at the University of North Carolina, we published a paper a few years ago asking exactly that question of kind of how many communities are there in social capital literature, and who are the most prominent scholars inside those communities. And we effectively found that there really are 6 different kind of bodies of literature that are relatively disjoint from one another in how they treat social capital. And in a few of those, they are kind of largely dominated by single key citations. I won't go through each one of these, but like the blue bar in panel A here is the kind of most prominent review article in an Academy of Business journal. That cluster is kind of very dominated by kind of business scholarship. And that paper kind of carries a lot of the weight. And similarly, different clusters here are dominated by different single citations. So kind of who's the most important in each one of these clusters is relatively different. But even more so, when I look at how they jointly combine the multiple types of definitions of social capital from different sources, these communities do this in very different ways. So the 3 that are mostly blue are effectively communities that really draw on a single scholar at a time. And I won't go into why the blue kind of characterizes that, but that's what this tells us. This is essentially communities where people are focusing on single scholars to develop their idea of what social capital means and how they then go about studying it. These kind of 2 that are kind of a mix, B and C, of red and blue colors, are ones that have kind of a few dominant scholars or papers that kind of shape how social capital is thought about. And then they tend to combine them, but they tend to combine them in pairwise fashion. They look at kind of 2 together or maybe 3 together in various specific combinations. Whereas this one that is mostly red, I'll reveal in that one, that tends to be the sociological version of social capital for what it's worth. They're attempting to do a lot of synthesis. I don't want to bore us with the details of what's going on here, but our summary of this was effectively that there really isn't, this is just an empirical demonstration that effectively there really isn't a single social capital. There are multiple social capitals out there. And the way they get kind of differentially deployed differs on kind of theoretical grounds, mechanistic grounds, measurement grounds, and what they find empirically, and in turn, how we might go about kind of intervening to improve social capital in various communities and things like that. So this is kind of just a base level start to say, perhaps not necessary to be demonstrated empirically, but I thought it was worth doing given some of our work, that we shouldn't think of social capital as a singular concept, but we should think of it as it has been used as kind of quite multiple. So this could lead us in a number of sorry about my dogs. I thought they would be quiet. We'll work on it. This could lead us to a number of kind of takeaways, and one thing that has been suggested is basically the idea that social capital as a concept is almost too broad to be useful, or said more specifically, that it's become so flexible that it means so many different things that how we kind of get utility out of it might have outlived its usefulness. And to this point, a very well-respected scholar in my field reached out to me about our citation paper and thought that it was an interesting kind of demonstration of these gaps. And then I told him what we were doing with it second, and he basically said, I don't think you should try that. And I and my collaborators have basically argued that we think that this approach of saying that social capital has become too flexible to be useful is effectively kind of throwing out something that is theoretically useful because of some of the problematic ways that it's been used. So our attempt is to figure out if there's something we can do to kind of recover the utility of the theoretical concept that brings together these disparate views. And so that's what our aim is in this project. And so this kind of came together. As I said, this happened kind of more happenstance, where I literally had developed like this slide deck over about 10 or 12 years, where I started explaining apparent contradictions or seeming problems in questions that I was asked over time. And then eventually I became convinced to try and turn this into something formal when one of my current PhD students was working on a dissertation on kind of organizational and relational effects on health outcomes, in particular in a kind of highly immigrant population in a community in Denver. And social capital was going to be kind of fundamental to a lot of her research. And so we needed to formalize some of these ideas to make them useful for her. And I had recently been collaborating with Miranda Lubbers, who's at the University of at the Autonomous University of Barcelona on some things unrelated to this, but fortunately she is a social capital expert. So this was a useful way to kind of bring all these ideas together and see if there was some synthesis that was possible along the lines of the interests that we had. And so we pitched this idea that is going to be the backbone of where I'm going next to the annual review of sociology. They liked it, and over the course of a little while, it came out just a little while ago. So that's what I'm presenting now. And so we start from a premise of basically asking a question whether or not we can identify a set of theorized dimensions of social capital that are fundamental to its conceptual and theoretical sets of orientations. And we're going to propose that there effectively are 3 of them that exist across the literature. Most of these don't, the full set doesn't exist as we read it kind of in explicit detail in any one, but across them, these seem to be common across at least a few of those. So the first kind of aim that we're going to take here is to identify what those dimensions look like. And in particular, we want to think about this as a conceptual and theoretical exercise, and not one that focuses on how they're subsequently measured or how they're subsequently evaluated or how we see empirical effects of those ideas. So this is really about what is core to the theory and not its uses. We're going to think then about how those kind of dimensions get combined and explore a little bit of how that might help clarify some of this existing confusion or apparent contradictions, and then think about what this tells us about potential ways forward of how we might reorient how we approach social capital research or application or intervention types of questions. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of each of these steps in the talk in the rest of the time we have here. So I could use any number of singular definitions here. Right now, I just have Bourdieu's at the top, but I'm not going to rely on this particularly heavily. I'm just going to suggest that you can see the dimensions we're about to suggest, at least implicitly in most of these types of definitions, if not explicitly. And our proposal is that there are really 3 primary dimensions that seem to capture the core concepts of what social capital is theorized to be or why it is theorized to be beneficial, one of those 2 things. And so the first is a question of where beneficial resources reside. And I'm going to go into more detail on each of these in the subsequent slides, but for the moment, we can just think about it. This is a differentiation between whether or not people hold those resources or the network holds those resources. The second kind of primary dimension, and again, I'll go into more detail in a minute, is about kind of what network patterns optimize those potential benefits. And this often gets talked about as cohesive networks versus sparse or bridging types of network positions. And then the third dimension that we identify as kind of fundamental in this literature is one of kind of to whom do rewards accrue. And what I mean by this, is this an individual, is something that individuals benefit from, or is this something that collectives benefit from? Those are the primary differences here. And this is the point at which I should probably say that this is both, this set is the result of a combination of the 3 of us kind of reading and diving into things a lot and that kind of history that I told you. But we also fielded a brief survey amongst self-identified experts of social capital and asked them how they felt about the dimensions we had identified. And then in a minute, I'm going to talk about how existing scholarship tends to fit within the characterization of these dimensions. We also asked in that survey for experts to kind of classify that positioning. So some of what I'm presenting here is kind of most of what I'm presenting here in that regard is some combination of our close read of the literature, synthesis thereof, and incorporating that survey feedback. I wouldn't call that a formal survey. I would call that more of an informal kind of making gut check kind of survey, if you will, to make sure we weren't completely off base from what other people suggest. Now, you might be thinking there are many other dimensions that a lot of people have thought about as fundamental to the kind of approach to social capital being either studied or leveraged in kind of practice opportunities. And we could talk about things like the positivity or negativity of outcomes that are associated with it, or the valence of capital types of resources, how this kind of is operationalized inside particular contexts or different across contexts, or how it gets accessed. Our contention, though, is that most of these additional dimensions that are often discussed as key to thinking about social capital are more about how social capital gets modified, the context in which it is employed, the distributions of its effects, or other things that are more about kind of how social capital gets used rather than what social capital is theorized to be or where its benefits tend to arise from. So we aren't dismissing those as important. We're thinking they're important in a different way than the conceptual or theoretical definitions of social capital, which is what we're fundamentally after. So those are the three, and let's talk about them in a little more detail. So like I said, the first that we identify is kind of if capital is some set of resources we can draw on to get rewards that we want in some beneficial way, the first question we have is kind of where do those resources currently exist? And one possibility is that effectively individuals possess them and networks or relationships provide a means to access the resources that those individuals have. And so this is kind of classically kind of measured in the way that like Nan Lin's version of position generators that I mentioned earlier is thought to kind of capture social capital is if I'm interested in, do I know somebody who could, fix a particular car problem or who could help me with a with a particular health issue? Can I access that in my network? This is people's skills that I need to use my relationships to find those types of skills that individuals hold. And this is contrasted against the idea that sometimes those resources aren't things that individuals hold, but things that kind of exist in a relationship, or Bourdieu even argues that social capital at times in his kind of theorization talks about it as something that the network itself has. And the classic example for me in this is like generalized trust, right? So trust in a community exists at a level that isn't about any one person or resource that people have, but it's something we can draw on from that collective. So we can think of the resource as being a collectively held resource or a network held resource in that context. So the theorizations and something that I'm going to point out is all of these across any of these pairs of these continua that we identify are thought to be beneficial in each one of their variants. So it's not that kind of one is beneficial and one is less or detrimental or less beneficial, but they're thought to be differentially important by kind of how people emphasize which of these are the kind of focus of their formulations of social capital, which I'll loop back to in a little while. So the second dimension we identified is one that is kind of where I come to a lot of things from is the kind of beneficial structure of networks. And this is the classic kind of Coleman and Burt, if you're familiar with those kind of versions, framing of how social capital is differentiated. So James Coleman's version of social capital basically says that cohesive networks where all of the people I spend a lot of my time around with also spend a lot of time with each other are good for fostering kind of high levels of reciprocity or norms and reinforcement of those things that can generate kind of beneficial outcomes for people who are in that cohesive set of others. And this often gets contrasted with Ron Burt's version that basically says the exact opposite is where social capital comes from, that somehow that sitting in between groups that are otherwise disconnected from one another, but well connected inside them, if I bridge between those, that by filling that structural hole, leverage some competitive advantage or even or other kind of opportunities for how these kind of bridging patterns tend to bring about the benefits of social capital. So this is a second dimension that we identify as pretty fundamental in a lot of the definitions. The third dimension that we identify as differentiating between these conceptualizations is the question of kind of to what level rewards tend to accrue. So there are social capital kind of theories out there that basically say, what can I do to improve my outcomes by leveraging social capital? And there's any number of examples of this in sociology. One example of this is a lot of immigration literature, particularly some of the work by Alejandro Portes, although he also problematizes this in some ways, but he has illustrated the idea that like assimilation can be optimized in some ways via access to social capital for individuals. And this is contrasted with the idea of rewards potentially being a collective outcome, right? So somehow like political efficacy or collective efficacy or like governance stability and things like that are things that are not rewards to the individual, but rewards to the population as a whole. So we see these three as kind of the if not explicit, often implicit kind of variations in some combination of the existing set of conceptualizations of social capital as they exist in the literature. So then the question that we are most motivated by here is what happens when we put all these pieces together. So I'm going to illustrate, there's a variety. illustrating things that are three-dimensional are tough. I'm teaching a class on on data visualization right now, and this is something that we actually tell our students often try to avoid doing. But in this case, we have three dimensions, so we have to kind of make sense of it. So I'm going to try and do that with what is known as a ternary plot. And basically, what I'm going to do here is combine those three kind of pairwise dimensions into a single plot here. So along the blue axis, if you will, we're going to have the where beneficial resources it currently reside question. And so the things that are kind of further to the bottom and to the left are going to be those kind of theoretical perspectives that assume those resources exist in individuals. And then the kind of top right is going to be those that assume that the beneficial resources somehow exist in the network rather than in the individuals. Similarly, for the kind of network structure pattern, cohesion is going to be towards the upper left, and more bridging types of patterns is going to be towards the bottom right. And we can have then the returns or the rewards that are available via accessing social capital as more individual towards the bottom and more collective towards the top. And so what we can do with this, and I want to point out that what I'm about to do is entirely meant to be heuristic. It is not meant to be actual like systematic placement of these kind of key scholars, but some of the key kind of theorized contributions to social capital literature, as were illustrated earlier in kind of the most cited papers and in some other kind of influential contributions, can be plotted in this way that basically thinks about not how does each theorist vary on any one of these dimensions at a time, as my illustrative cases were doing earlier, but how do they vary on all three of these dimensions simultaneously? And I don't want to kind of step through each one of these individually, in part because the claim that I'm going to make in a moment is that most of these scholars really were interested in one, sometimes two of these at a time, and often didn't really think about a third or had reasons to think about the third as something separate. Our fundamental claim isn't so much that this tells us something, but this type of landscape can tell us something about how we might want to go forward with this idea. So the first time we ever presented this, people wanted to really talk about where we placed each one of these scholars. And we could do that, and I think it's interesting, but I actually think it's more tangential to what our actual point is here rather than our primary aim. So for now, I'm just thinking about this as an illustrative way to put the pieces together of how these three dimensions can be combined, even when some of the scholarship previously hasn't done so. And it's going to lead us to ask a set of questions that are like, what do we do with these multiple dimensions? And the first is kind of where we started, that there isn't a single social capital, but more there's multiples of them. And in particular, that it's not really that there's actually multiple social capitals, but instead that there's one and there's multiple dimensions. And what has happened is that previous kind of leveraging of these dimensions has led people to focus primarily on one or two of these at a time and have a different view that is primarily based on different emphases across these dimensions because they're drawing on a different subset and either ignoring others or other sorts of things. So we think that kind of doing this in this way can help us identify potentially some of the sources of existing contradictions and maybe pull them back together in some ways, which I'm going to attempt to do in the next few comments. So this, before I get to that, this suggests that what we ought to do is to the practical implication of this kind of one versus multiple social capitals, where we suggest there's one that has multiple dimensions, is that what we are contending should happen is that when we theorize or kind of try and use the idea of social capital, we should recognize it as having all of these dimensions, and then we should specify the leveraging of each one of those dimensions and how we address those in any one kind of use of social capital simultaneously. But if we want to only look at one of them, we can do that, and we're not discouraging that, but we should label those as the dimensions and not label them as social capital per se. I use the kind of people noticing kind of different parts of the elephant classic metaphor in the visual in the previous slide. I tend to think of this as the like difference between describing kind of the skeletal system and the like nervous system and the like circulatory system, and describing any one of those as having studied anatomy. It's like we wouldn't talk about any one of those as though we've captured full anatomy, but we have this tendency in social capital to talk about any one or combination or paired combination of those as those we've captured the whole thing. And our contention here is that social capital really is about this kind of confluence of all of these things, and those dimensions are separable in kind of thinking about them differentially. But if we want to talk about social capital, we really have to engage with where whatever we are doing addresses each one of those simultaneously. So that's the first piece, which is going to help us hopefully do some harmonization of previous scholarship. And I said already that we think that some of the existing kind of potential gaps or contradictions are largely because of different foci amongst potential combinations of these things. So let me illustrate this explicitly. So one version that we've seen in some of the existing kind of scholarship or application of scholarship to kind of leveraging social capital in public health or kind of business or whatever kind of applications is focusing on one of these dimensions at a time, having conditioned on another. So this is like looking for kind of advantages of cohesive or bridging types of networks, looking only in cohesive or bridging types of networks and examining kind of whether collective outcomes are more commonly observed in one or the other of those. And this is like some of Bert's early work did some of this, for example. So this is the idea that we're basically ignoring the other dimensions or selecting cases that are similar on other dimensions and only focusing on variation on one dimension at a time in that kind of conditioned scenario. This is different from the idea that we would kind of capture potential cases that we're interested in, study a variety of cases. So we might study things like sets of classrooms. And we might be interested in kind of focusing on one of these dimensions, like rewards that accrue at the individual level for school performance, for example. And we might do that controlling for how cohesive or how kind of characterized by structural wholes those classrooms are, and just like statistically control for those things to get the independent effect of social capital access, irrespective of what the structure of it looks like for individuals' school performance. And we're suggesting that that is focusing on the kind of accessibility or activation of social capital more than in a particular form, rather than thinking about kind of the composite construct. So this is another example of how kind of narrowing our focus has led us to talk past one another at times, because those things that one person is controlling away are exactly the thing that somebody else wants to focus on in some respects. So a third possibility, and this is one that I think there's a lot of literature that is doing this out there, that is basically saying study A finds one thing and study B finds the exact opposite thing. And the reason that they tend to find the exact opposite thing is they're varying on some third dimension that they're really just not paying attention to in the study. And it's that third thing that is changing the effect that they're observing in their example. So in their cases. So the example I have here is basically suggesting that trust at a collective level might have different returns in a population for individuals or even for the collective inside that population if we're looking at cohesive versus more sparse or kind of more structurally whole characterized networks. And so the idea here is that we shouldn't expect the pattern to necessarily be the same in how particular rewards turn into or particular resources turn into particular rewards if the structures are fundamentally different that are supporting those. So the suggestion here is that maybe we can find the reason for some of those kind of seemingly contradictory findings by putting the third piece back in. And I'm just using that example of bridging versus cohesion. You could do this in basically any combination in my experience in the literature. And I'll highlight a few that we think in a moment. I'll highlight a few that we think are particularly ripe for kind of rethinking these kind of full combinations. This is kind of one of the kind of key kind of backward facing things, like what this does for how we've interpreted what people have found before when they use the kind of multiple definitions of social capital. If we put them all together, how would it lead us to different implications? And these are kind of a set of our claims with respect to that. The second thing I would say with respect to how to harmonize previous scholarship in some respects is probably something that doesn't need to be explicitly said because it's implicitly in what we're stating, but we thought it was an important enough point to bring in here explicitly. And that is, we are talking about these as dimensions alongst which our theorizations can vary. So we could talk about cohesive networks as beneficial, or we could talk about bridging networks as beneficial, but we should not use the language I just did in the either or. And the reality is that a lot of networks tend to exist somewhere between those. And we could probably find benefits of theorizing with the network benefits or the resource location benefits as as importantly derived from kind of the liminal parts of these dimensions as much as from the kind of polar category. So not thinking about these as categorical differences, but thinking about them as potentially kind of continuously variable things is something that might allow for a more flexible notion of how social capital actually operates is a second thing. And this is something that kind of came up in the course of writing. We realized we were talking about them in kind of bins, but in reality, we wanted to talk about them more in kind of a continuous form like this. So we're encouraging other people to do the same. So the last place I want to take this is kind of, okay, so what would we do with this, right? And so like, that's all well and good. Are we just kind of trying to make sense of a literature and does it have kind of any practical implications? And so I'm going to suggest kind of two versions of implications for our purposes. And I'm just going to use a couple of illustrative cases from our paper to make each one of these. And the first is whether or not this suggests that maybe there are combinations that just haven't been explored because of kind of differential emphases in previous literature. And I'm going to highlight a few of those. Does the framework tell us some ways that we might alter how we would assess some existing kind of open questions in the fields of social capital? So I'll, in that case, just highlight a couple. But I want to use for a moment this is just a two-dimensional projection of what we suggested three-dimensionally. So basically using any two of the dimensions simultaneously. In the upper part of the panel, I have an illustrative version at the bottom of all three. But basically, one thing that we noticed as we started to look at kind of which combinations tend to dominate the literature or be most represented in kind of how people have thought about social capital was effectively there are like on the diagonal and there's like assumed associations between some of these, and a lot of the space of what is underexplored is what we would in statistics we would describe as the off diagonal. What I mean by this is kind of there's an assumed pattern and the kind of non-assumed part of that pattern is ignored either implicitly or explicitly, or less emphasized, I should say, rather than ignored. So one example of this highlighted in the upper right there, in that kind of lower quadrant, is that when bridging structural configurations are, when access to resources are located in the network. So if we're talking about resources that aren't things that individuals hold, but things that the network holds, something like generalized trust, whether being evaluated for individual or collective benefit, we found that bridging structural configurations tend to be less kind of focused on in this context. So if we're thinking about a network resource, regardless of what type of return we're looking at, people have tended to focus on the cohesive network structure as one that kind of network resources tend to optimize. And so it's possible that bridging structure has similar benefits, but we haven't as well kind of understood that process in what scholarship has currently done. Similarly, sorry, my mouse got stuck. When people have examined personal resources, so resources that exist in the individual, and irrespective of kind of what network structural form they've tended to focus on, they've tended to focus largely on individual rewards or not collective. I'm highlighting in the text here the ones that we think are the opportunity. I'm talking about the way that the literature has focused. So this is saying collective rewards could be something that we could learn a lot more about when we are examining kind of resources that are thought to exist in the individual. And what you can hear in both of these examples is there seems to be a conflation in some of the literature that if resources are individual, then the returns are individual. If resources are collective, then the returns are collective. And we're suggesting that that doesn't necessarily need to be associated in that way, that network resources can be beneficial to individuals. Individual resources can be beneficial to the collective in ways that we find is somewhat under-theorized in the current literature. Those two examples both focus on kind of just leveraging kind of gaps across two dimensions at a time. The third example I have here actually thinks about a gap that is three-dimensional, and that is that an example of where cohesive networks, potential for generating collective rewards, tends to have been underemphasized when resources are primarily theorized to be held by individuals. So the idea is that and we could therefore suggest kind of altering this in one of two ways. We could focus still on collective rewards from resources that individuals hold, but think about how bridging potential optimizes that. Or we could think about how individual rewards are possible in cohesive networks differentially than how collective rewards result from this. So the basic punchline is that there are things that the kind of different prioritizations amongst these singular or paired combinations of dimensions in previous literature has ignored by not having all three of them kind of simultaneously in the way we are thinking about social capital that we think is a potential avenue for future research. That's a little bit kind of more on the theoretical or high level. So the next examples kind of try and drill this down to the approach of, sorry, mailman, try and drill this down to the example of how like particular, give me just a second, sorry. Hey, guys, come here. How particular examples in existing literature on specific topics might be altered if we adapt this strategy. So one example, as Tristan mentioned earlier, I have a history having worked in public and population health for a while. And a kind of common version of social capital in that literature has focused a lot on informal social support, how the provision of informal social support can be beneficial for people in a variety of ways. This literature has usefully differentiated kind of the availability of support versus the activation of social support. And I want to leverage that in a minute. But I would point out that a lot of this literature has highly focused on individual rewards and resources that are often in the individual, are sometimes in a relationship, and so focusing dyadically, like in a couple, is my partner doing something or is my sibling doing something, but not really thinking about the network structure as a whole in terms of like bridging or cohesive types of questions. In how social support provision improves health outcomes, be they mental or physical health types of things. So our suggestion is that it's possible that the resource activation process in particular might be really different if the resources reside in individuals than if they reside in the network. In particular, there's a lot of literature that suggests that kind of like resource activation in the network sense is sometimes more difficult when individuals can kind of keep, hoard, or limit access to that. Whereas if it's in the network as a whole, it might be different. And so the idea is that if we want to kind of make sense of how social support actually operates, that we might need to recognize that kind of the network structural features might alter the way population health researchers have often thought about kind of individual or dyadic level resources as improving population health outcomes. It might or said it more simply, it might not always work the same if the network structure around a person is quite different, is something that this points us towards. And there's some literature that dives into this, but not in a way that this we think helps systematize. And the last, the kind of other example that I want to kind of leverage in this sense is something that I'm currently teaching in an orgs theory class to undergrads right now. And so this is something they force me to think about a lot in I hope useful ways. Is that inside organizations, we're often interested in how like unequal resource distributions and or unequal kind of reward allocations happen inside organizations. There's been a lot of work that suggests that like there are various forms of beneficial internal team dynamics. Like there's benefits of being a part of a cohesive team for getting kind of a participation buy-in and resulting kind of organizational performance outcomes. But our contention is that in some level that this kind of reward realization might be differentially available across subgroups. That's not a huge claim, but the kind of implication of our theory for that, of our theoretical framework for that claim is that if we assume the position of social capital's resources like in the network and something about its structural benefits, the cohesion. So if trust is something that is a collective good and cohesion fosters trust at a network level, that this is often assumed to be associated in particular patterns with the types of rewards that are available. In the example I just drew, that often would be leading to kind of an assumption of collective rewards. I could put other combinations in here, but I think that example is illustrative because it leads to a case where cohesion might provide individual level rewards, but it might do so in ways that are unequal in various ways, particularly that it might be accessible to in-group members and inaccessible to out-group members in ways that could reinforce or create subgroup level inequalities between teams or across individuals, rather than those rewards kind of truly accruing to everybody in the organization. And so this idea of thinking about how we might differentially allow for the association between things like network structure and resource location in thinking about whether we're concerned with individual or collective level outcomes is something that this helps us hopefully kind of fine tune what our claims really are about and why they might differ. So it's a bit kind of There are many more examples of either one of those types that we have both in the paper and that we've talked about that that might be worth continuing with. But just as kind of a brief distillation of what I think we've attempted to accomplish here, we'll see how well it has as people have kind of received this work. Is first that we're thinking that social capital really is a multidimensional concept. That these are these dimensions we've talked about are kind of fundamental to its definition, and in particular that kind of the way previous scholarship has leveraged them has often differentially focused on usually one or a subset of these rather than emphasizing all of them simultaneously. And we think that putting them together points the way towards some alterations in existing or open questions. But in particular, we are hoping that this will help kind of fine tune the way people talk about this, that we can specify what elements of these dimensions our theorization and or use of social capital is leveraging and which ones aren't. And when we interpret our findings, it can force us to be more explicit about how what we have done is situated in the full set of combinations, rather than assuming that, focusing on any one or two is capturing them all simultaneously, because hopefully there's some convincing that these are at least potentially independent from one another in various ways. That's where I will pause for where we want to go from here.
Great. Thanks very much, Jimmy. Fascinating presentation. Lots of really interesting ideas in there. So we'll take some questions and discussion. Feel free to either raise your hand within Zoom, which you'll find under the React button, or alternatively, you can post in the chat, and when we come to you, you can unmute yourself to ask your question. Of course, if you're not currently in a position to ask the question yourself, just let me know in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it out on your behalf. So if I can, Jimmy, I might start with the first question, because over the years, I've tried to find definitions of what people mean by resources, and this seems to be a term that is almost never defined. And the only definitions I can typically find go back to the original ones provided, say, by Nan Lin. So I was wondering if you had an insight of what is actually meant by the term resources.
This is the short answer is you all probably have thought about this more than I have, but I think there might be some value in that in some respects. And the main one of the things that I often, when I talk to both students and kind of these that are thinking about projects in this and characterizing this, is what is different about social capital from other forms of capital, right? And so the idea here is that at their core, all of these definitions think that there's something about relational elements, whether in metaphor or in explicit form, are part of that. So I think of that as kind of pointing me towards one of two things. And this is now you're going to get my network view of things. Not that's beneficial, but is sometimes the network provides like a conduit through which things can be passed. So one type of resources are things that are transferable. And that's maybe an unsatisfactory answer. But another one is, and this is where I think the conflation or kind of confusion sometimes arises, is for me that there are also things that are kind of joint task or joint effort sorts of things, right? That a relationship can provide not the channeling of something, but a combination of things that is not otherwise available. And so there's something about that structure that might itself be a resource. So all that to say, I think a lot of things can fit here. There might be reason to exclude things, but the things that are kind of passable or the things that are combinable are the way I like to think of kind of what's different about like social capital versus other forms of capital in that regard.
Yeah, because it certainly seems to span like the things that are transferable, perhaps, are examples of physical or perhaps even human capital that are transferable. But then, like you said, there's probably some less tangible kind of resources that may also arise as a result of what we're talking about of social capital. And so it seems to span this incredible variety from the original definition of social resources by Nan Lin, which was more about kind of influence and power than tangible kind of physical capital and human capital, all the way through to those kind of more tangible examples. And so as you were talking, it sort of struck me, and I posted in the chat, an idea that maybe the location of where people see these resources existing is perhaps a function of how they're actually defining what they mean by resources at all. Because the physical capital, the human capital, like that kind of almost has to exist in the individual, has to be mobilized by an individual. Whereas the other forms of resources, the influence and the power and so forth, like they almost can't, well, they can reside in an individual, but they kind of reside as a result of the collective, in the context of the collective. So I don't know
I
if that
guess
makes sense.
it does. I think there's one thing that our kind of perspective does help illuminate here, and that is it doesn't kind of define what are resources, but it does point out that some of the scholarship, as we read it on social capital, tends to think about resources and rewards as we have differentiated them here as effectively either fully overlapping or interchangeable. And so one thing that it would suggest is we should think of those as potentially separable definitions. The things that I can get via social capital that is a resource can turn into other types of rewards. And this particularly the kind of individual to collective kind of translation or vice versa that ours kind of allows for, I think has been under examined in a lot of this work in our perspective, in part because it is assumed that they're at times they're assumed to be the same, not just overlapping. Like the benefit I get is via whatever it is that I have access to. But most capital is about converting. Most capital arguments of any flavor about converting capital of one form to another. And so this kind of reward resource distinction, I think, is something we're kind of making more explicit than some of those kind of previous conflations have assumed are overlapping. Maybe I'm wrong, but
Yeah.
that was one thought.
No, I agree with that, I think. And I think that few of the key benefits that I see what you're doing here is that it's highlighting and encouraging people to question what we actually mean by resources, which is, as we've just been discussing, is often just assumed. And then the
Yep.
other point about the accrual is that's really about the outcomes, the reward accrual. It's really about the outcomes and how they manifest in different kinds of ways. And so similarly, like all forms of capital, it is something that does something. It provides a return. And that return effectively is that reward accrual. And what does that actually mean? Like what kind of outcomes produced and in what kind of ways? So I think there's some of the really key benefits of the work you're doing is it's encouraging that kind of thought and questioning of the theory.
I would agree with that.
So let's go to Chris first. You've got your hand up. Feel free to unmute yourself to pose your question or
Great.
comment.
Thanks, Tristan. Thanks, Jimmy, for this great presentation. So, Mike, I mean, your fresh perspective. You say you come slightly as an outsider, bringing things. I mean, it's obviously incredibly valuable, and I'm curious when you think about this theoretical work you're doing. Of course, one of the reasons that we, people who study social capital, have a challenge is that differentiation between theory and measurement, and in addition to all the different contexts in which we're measuring. And so I'm curious, just from your skill as a theorist, how do you think about translating a framework like this, which is really helpful to see, to measurement? Sort of, what's the relationship between measurement and a multidimensional framework?
Yeah, so there's a two-part answer to this question. And the first part is that we explicitly didn't do that in the paper for a reason. But the second part is the reason is to make it useful. So the first part of this is that we think that a lot of times some of the constraints that we identified were people kind of thinking in how they have measured things as a way to kind of make sense of what the concept was meant to be in the first place. And so what we wanted to do before we got to measurement was think about what the conceptual potential disentangleable elements were. So we would argue that the measure, and this is where my work in kind of networks and kind of data collection strategies and evaluation of network of data collection strategies does come in, is the measurement kind of orientations should follow from the theoretical kind of distinctions and not allow for the overlap. So this kind of point of like that we were just having of measuring a resource as something that is separable from a reward is like a very practical implication of how we would translate this into operationalization or measurement considerations. And I would argue similarly, like there are versions, like I used the case of the name generator from Nan Lin earlier, and that wasn't meant to criticize it. It was meant to highlight the point that it doesn't really address anything about social structure, about bridging or cohesive sorts of arguments. And so if we want to capture that, we have to do something different. And the idea here is that if we really want to kind of deal with this, at minimum, you would need kind of three, primary notions. You couldn't, and that are fully separable analytically and measurement wise. Often most of us want more than one kind of particular kind of question or particular item to capture any dimension. And so you might want to think about things that are kind of different elements of like cohesion versus bridging, and like holding a resource versus having access to a resource in your network. This is the translation step that I would be doing, is thinking about which one or ones of those any single measure has the capacity to deal with simultaneously. And our contention, primarily in terms of measurement implications, would be that we should be thinking about these as separate. And the problem has often arisen before when either implicitly people have conflated them, or explicitly we've assumed they are the same across these. And so it's not a like concrete, okay, this translates into, this particular question. But the idea that I think we have here is this now tells us that our measures need to be separable on on each one of these things simultaneously. So what it is you're trying to get access to. And I would argue that in social capital, there are a lot of different types of resources, but then that are potentially kind of salient here. But thinking about whether or not these are things that people have, right? So, knowledge of information in the like job seeking sorts of case, or things that are available via the network, kind of how you get access to that knowledge, are quite different questions than are kind of assuming that is kind of one joint thing. So one thing that measurement often kind of requires is kind of pulling apart, and we're suggesting that these dimensions help identify how you would pull them apart, right? And I would argue you need to do that across each one of them separately rather than in any pair of them simultaneously often. Is that an unsatisfactory answer, or I don't know?
Very, very, very useful, and in its realism. I think I'm trying, like, I like this theoretical framework that you shared to help have us pose the sort of the hard questions of how we might put the scholarship and different definitions in relation to each other in ways that, like it's true. And Tristan's been working on this for a long time to try to put together. I guess my sort of follow-up question would be, if we have a unified theoretical conception, like, does that actually then lead to a unified toolkit in a way? I mean, what do tools look like in a world in which you have a unified theoretical conception?
Yeah, that's an interesting, because in some ways the way we're thinking about it is it leads us to a kind of multiplicity of kind of toolkit, the need for a multiple toolkit rather than a singular one, and that is kind of part of the problem, we think. So yeah, ironically, I don't know. Yeah.
All right, let's go to a few more questions in the chat, shall we? So unfortunately, Audrey's had to leave to teach a class, but they ask, can AI potentially create, consume, or control social capital? Now, that's incredibly broad, but do you want to have a go at answering that?
That's an interesting one. I'm not sure that's something that I have a formulated thought on, to be honest.
My initial thought would be we'd need to probably try and clarify some of the things we mean by what social capital is and how it functions, and what creating, consuming, and controlling it perhaps means.
Yeah. I have some half-baked thoughts, but I think particularly given that we're recorded, I'm gonna
Yeah.
not offer half-baked thoughts.
Absolutely. And it's certainly a big topic, as a huge number of people are very interested in the role of AI and how it will shape social capital. And clearly, across all of those dimensions, you can see how the use of AI might change the availability of resources, the way in which people interact, the way in which people feel and relate to each other, and the way in which rewards are accrued. So I think it clearly has a big influence, but the question, of course, really remains exactly how it'll function. And I think from what I'm hearing from a lot of people is that probably comes down to the way in which social capital is being used, that it's a tool and it can be used positively or negatively in terms of how it actually shapes social capital.
I see a question in the chat that I would like to raise. Am I allowed to do that?
Sure. Is that from Ian?
Yes, that one.
Ian, would you like to unmute yourself to ask your question? Looks like you did unmute yourself, but we can't hear you. I'd have a problem. How about I ask the question, and if you get your audio working, then you can do a follow-up. Can you elaborate further on the continuous nature of each dimensions? I like it, but your examples sounded more distinct categorical, e.g. individual or collective benefits.
Yeah, I mean, this is so in sociology, we tend to leverage the idea of an ideal type where we can kind of define in poles and then we can contrast the kind of measurement or experience of things as though they differ from these kind of idealized or sometimes dichotomous versions. And when I talk about ideal types, I always have to leverage, if you're not familiar with the idea, we aren't thinking desirable. It's just kind of making the mental construct more kind of purely definitional. And so I'll start with the example that comes first to mind for me. In networks, almost no networks are kind of truly kind of segmented, nor are they truly cohesive. Most networks exist somewhere between those. So we could talk about the benefits as you approach kind of a more cohesive network, or as you approach kind of bridging more structural holes as potentially more beneficial. And then the question for me in particular of why we're interested in that continuous space is, does that suggest to us that networks that are neither highly cohesive nor especially bridging, so if people are kind of in a more kind of connective position, but not kind of uniquely connecting groups and not really kind of sitting in a well-nested group, does that as a result of being neither cohesive nor bridging, does that also provide rewards, or is that an absence of the availability of capital, is a question that we think this leads us to. I don't have an answer to it, but it formulates a different question. Because right now we basically assume that like bridging is good or cohesion is good, but this is saying, what does their kind of either joint absence or joint presence, which is actually kind of sometimes effectively available. What does that lead us to consider for the kind of returns of social capital? Or your example of kind of individual or collective benefits. As I mentioned, I think one of the things that we as kind of sociologists who are mostly working on this are resolutely concerned with is kind of inequalities in outcomes. So beneficial rewards that accrue to some individuals but not others, particularly as that might be differentiated by subgroups, is another version of this. So we often kind of theorize or intervene in ways that are thought to be good for a full organization or an entire group, but the reality is that it often is not going to kind of equally benefit everybody in the group. And so there are kind of differential kind of subgroup accessibility questions that I think this points us towards, that sits somewhere in between the like full collective and individual. And I could do that for the resource one as well. But the idea here is thinking about what that kind of in-between space, whether this is thought to be kind of an absence of benefit or a benefit of a lesser degree, or maybe even like something else, is something that I don't think it's been asked because of the kind of categorical approach that we have, as much as it could be as we think about these as potential kind of spectra instead of simple groups is the point there. Hopefully that gets at your question a little bit, Ian. As I'm actually suggesting that's part of the open question, that this drives us towards, more than that we have reason to expect different answers in a variety of ways there.
And Ian, if you get your mic working, feel free to pose a follow-up. And of course, you can post in the chat too, and I'd be welcome to, I'll read it out on your behalf. And perhaps here also, like these different, they exist simultaneously. So we can have a cohesive network and a bridging network simultaneously. And that the categorization tends to also result in us seeing things as either one or the other, when, like you're saying, it's often somewhere in between because it's actually both simultaneously.
And I mean, to that point, one of my favorite series of papers to teach to my undergrads is the classic Coleman, Katz, and Menzel study, which some of you may be familiar with or not, but it's a study of the diffusion of the adoption of tetracycline as an antibiotic in the 50s. And basically there's a sequence of papers where they think of it as like a network diffusion story, and then later they think of it as a network cohesion story, and later they think of it as a story of like joint effects of media exposure. And subsequently, it's the same data were reanalyzed, and basically each of 4 papers overturned the interpretation of the previous one. And then once we got statistical methods that allowed us to actually compete all of these together, the answer was actually it's a little bit of all of those. And this is a good example of like treating something like cohesion and bridging as though they're competing hypothesis, but exactly as you said, sometimes they actually combine in particular ways. So sometimes it's not even like it's not an either or, nor is it necessarily like what's the word? Uh, Man, sorry, brain is like pausing. Sometimes it's both and as much as it is. It doesn't necessarily have to be a compromise between them either. It sometimes can be kind of the joint presence of both, as you phrased it, Tristan.
Yeah, exactly. So we still have a little bit of time. If anybody has any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or post in the chat. It strikes me how similar. I gave a webinar on this on a very similar topic. I think I called it towards a unified framework for social capital rather than a unified conceptualization of social capital, but almost exactly the same title. And I also used the parable of the blind men coming across the elephant and perhaps seeing different parts of it. And the approach that I ended up using was to break it down into what I saw as kind of two core dimensions. One, producing the opportunity for social action to occur, and the other kind of looking at why people would engage in that social action when the opportunity does arise. So I kind of framed that as predispositions to be like a superordinate for trust and norms and belonging and identity and like all of these kind of descriptors that influence effectively the mechanisms, I suppose, of why people actually engage in social action. And that seems to be something that everybody agrees on, that social capital is effectively about relationships between people. It's about the actions and interactions between people that produce certain kinds of outcomes. And so I was wondering, like, where do you think those kinds of things you often see in the literature, like trust, norms, belonging, identity, solidarity, and so on and so on? You've probably seen the big long list that exists. Where would they fit, do you think, within the multi-dimensionality that you've outlined in your model?
So let me tag on to the first part of your comment there before I get to the second part, because I would think that in some ways our notion of kind of network structural benefit and our notion of kind of resource location in combination are what I would think of as opportunity, in the way that in the brief distillation that you just
Yep.
had, is like I think that is kind of what forms the opportunity, is kind of how it's accessible in that way. And then we did engage a fair amount with considering whether this kind of differentiation of like cognitive social structure or like potential social structure, that's cognitive social capital or potential social capital, as it's out there in the literature, as different, as somehow different from that kind of like structural version of it. And we thought of that as more kind of the activation of what are thought to be kind of types of available resources and translation into. So the kind of and this is where I think framework and conceptualization are a good characterization there, because I think you're kind of getting in that, when we think of it, we would suggest that is getting into the like, what do we do with these kind of potentially beneficial resources, which is separate from what our task was. So I think that's a new and additional kind of layer on top of what we're after here. Now, to your question of kind of what these kind of notions of trust, et cetera, are, I'll admit that we overglossed one differentiation in our kind of version of this paper in some ways that actually goes back to the previous question in a number of ways. Is as a network person, I like to think about the world as comprised of relationships and the people that they entail, rather than people and the relationships that they have. And the reason I would say that is I would argue that like things like trust and the other things that you had in your list there are minimally resources that are either dyadic, pairwise, or network. They often aren't things that individuals hold. And so what I was saying that we somewhat glossed over in our approach is we tended to think about kind of relational or dyadic things as part of the network version of our story, rather than as the individual version of our story. And there's only classic sociological reason for that, that comes from Zimmel. But in some respects, you might think of these kind of more dyadic presences as that liminal space of sitting somewhere in between network and individual, rather than what we did is kind of classify them in the network space. So I would suggest that the short answer is I would suggest they're not individual resources, but like where it sits along kind of the other side of the continuum is probably more variable than the characterization as I discussed it would have suggested.
Yeah, I think that'd be my take as well, that they effectively end up being similar to collective resources, that something like a social norm exists within a collective effectively, and perhaps it's akin to what a lot of the scholars would refer to as a collective resource, perhaps. But I think like at the end of the day, I think what I was most interested in was trying to get to with the framework was trying to get to like what are the mechanisms that are producing these outcomes? Like what is it
Yeah.
that's influencing people's actions, both providing the opportunity and the ability, but also shaping the nature of it as well. And like you said, that's a different approach to the approach that you've taken, looking at different ways of categorizing the literature, I suppose.
And this is one of the things that the further into my career I've gotten more comfortable with saying is I'm perfectly happy to be able to say that that is a question that we hope other people will take up. I think it is very important. I'm not suggesting it's not, but I think that sometimes we try to answer. Ironically, not this project, but the book project that I mentioned briefly, where we're thinking about interdisciplinary fields. This is a good example where we think that people tried to figure out what kind of beneficial versions of interdisciplinarity were before they figured out what the different flavors of an interdisciplinary could look like. And I would argue that we're kind of trying to do the same thing here, is kind of concretize what we mean theoretically before we think about where they come from or kind of what the benefits of them look, how those benefits get kind of generated, if you will. And I think that doing those things, we hope that doing those things will be easier on top of a structure like what we provided here, where people like you all who do this more than I do can leverage this in ways that like I don't feel equipped to be able to answer the question as you're posing it in that regard.
Yeah, and the reason I invited you to give a webinar is because I think what you've done is absolutely vital to the field, because all of the things we've been discussing, encouraging people to examine what they actually mean by resources, where they actually reside, how that relates to the other aspects of the capital and the way that it functions is absolutely critical. And it's something we haven't had enough of until now. And so the more of this, the more of the work that you do, and the more people can engage with that work and think about how it relates to their own work, I see as better for the concept overall and the field of study in general.
Good. That's consistent with our aims.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Chris, you had your hand up briefly before. Did you want to pose a question or a comment?
I mean, I'm really enjoying this, I think, and you summarized it really well. I guess my question is about disciplinarity and how you think about that. I mean, you're clearly very, and actually just saw you'll be here in Chapel Hill, it looks like, on Friday.
Yeah.
Great. Well, maybe I'll get to see you in person. But the but coming from the discipline of sociology, like what do you think are the lessons when in the work you've done for multi and interdisciplinary work? Sort of, I think that's a challenge in social capital, right? Like our disciplines don't always see eye to eye, or don't want to. Maybe I don't.
Yeah. Uh, I'm going to give probably the most unsatisfactory answer to that question ever. Is we have um, pretty intentionally not done any evaluative work on what interdisciplinary fields look like, or should look like in our work, in part because we think, and this is a similar version here is, and I can actually draw the parallel to what we're talking about here in a number of ways, is we think that people have jumped to an evaluation of what has worked without realizing what the like counterfactual possibilities could have been in clearly specified forms in like articulable, separable kind of dimensions. And so we've spent most of our time doing something similar to what we did here, there, of trying to figure out what the separate kind of possibilities of boundary crossing across disciplines could look like before we figure out which of those possibilities are beneficial versus detrimental. And we think that in similar ways to what Tristan was just saying, if we start to kind of evaluate things without being able to clearly kind of pull apart, or in economist's terms, like identify which source they're coming from, if you will, we run the risk of conflating our interpretations with kind of observed constraints. And so I'd be happy to talk about that further. But I think on the interdisciplinary side, our big contention is that we need to move backwards before we can answer that question in a lot of depth before we can actually jump to a good answer to that question. That's why I said it's going to be an unsatisfactory answer.
All right, we've got one question that's popped up in the chat from Alex. They ask, amazing work and presentation. I love the paper and find it useful. My question concerns where the resources reside dimension. That's the only dimension where I find it hard to think of it as a continuous, and I see it more like a categorical differentiation on what analysts have to make a choice and make it explicit, specifying whether they are looking at the collective network social capital or rather the individual dyadic one. What do you think about it? Any examples of the middle points on this dimension?
Yeah, and that one, the classic example of a middle point there would be negotiation. That, you know, like I can walk away from particularly kind of repeated potential negotiations if I'm having to. I would think of like the kind of interaction itself and or the like social construction of the relationship as a potential resource that is kind of independent of what I'm bringing to it, or it's a combination of what multiple parties are bringing to it. And it's not really kind of something that exists in the network, because as soon as I leave the negotiation, kind of there's no longer kind of an involvement. It doesn't exist outside of my participation in it, but it also isn't mine alone, if you will, in a negotiation type of context. So that's one that I would see as sitting squarely in between on that continuum. There's other kind of these kind of interactional dynamics as resource is something that I would think of as kind of fitting in that version. And lots of, as a social network scholar, I tend to think of lots of kind of relationships, not as things that exist or not, but things that are enacted. And it's that like enactment type of process that I would be thinking of as somehow in between those, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting explanation. Because I think I'd thought of a similar kind of thing. Like if it did come down to definitional, then you've got kind of one definition or a different definition. But I think the way you've explained it describes how it could be somewhere in between. Of course, we'd still need to define what we mean by resources in some capacity.
Yeah, yeah, but yeah, this is where yeah, the like social construction interaction kind of version is what I have in my mental version of the in between space on those kind of
Right.
resource positions.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we still do have a little bit of time if anyone has any final questions, but make sure you get them in soon, because if there aren't any more, then we'll look to wrap up shortly. One of the things perhaps to think about, and I don't really have an answer for this at all, but many of the definitions seem to be talking about social capital as being something quite different in the way that it functions in relation to the logic of capital and what it does. And the biggest distinction seems to be those that see it as something that does produce returns, whether it's networks or it's norms or it's trust, whatever that might be. But then there's another whole kind of group of definitions that almost say that the capital is the resources. So effectively, it is the returns, and more leaning in, I guess, to the metaphor of it being like capital rather than actually functioning as capital. And I'm not sure how that really quite fits into this sort of dimension approach, and whether it's something that is another kind of complication or whether we can just ignore that.
I mean, there are a number of papers out there, and I'm sure you all are familiar with some of them, you know, that basically ask the question of, is social capital really capital in the capital sense, right? And I think that's part of the crux of what you're raising. And one of the versions that I know Claude Fisher has suggested in particular is that if it's not kind of transferable and or kind of transformable, is it really capital in the way that we talk about like human or physical capital in ways? And that the way we talk about social capital basically assumes that it isn't, because that it's something somehow kind of outside the individual, and therefore, and so his contention is that really therefore capital. I don't draw the line quite as hard as he does, but that might be something that's easier for me to do from the outside than from the inside of trying to make sense of how this would work. But part of the reason that I would say that is, for me, it is for the way I've traditionally thought about kind of what we mean when we say capital is something that we can turn from kind of one form of whatever resource is into some other good that we're interested in. And in this case, what makes it kind of fundamentally different in the social sense is that it's not something like that exists outside me and like physical world. It's not something that I hold like human version. It's something that is either inherent in or only accessible in the relationships. And that distinction that I just made, kind of inherent in or only accessible via, is what I would argue is the differentiation we're making on the kind of where the resources reside level, is that we don't necessarily have to assume that it is only one of those. A lot of the literature up to this point has assumed that it is only one of those. But we think that the utility of social capital could be kind of via access or via the kind of existing in a network kind of form, similarly, that makes it kind of socially different from other forms of capital and still capital, I guess would be my somewhat oversimplified version of an answer to that. And I've had a couple of exchanges with Claude about this, and I'm still yet to be clear on whether he thinks that's a convincing answer or not.
Yeah, and I think the way it's often been talked about in the literature is the confusion between what the stock and the flow of the
Yeah.
capital is. And certainly a lot of the definitions just completely mix those two up, and there's no clear boundary between them, which I think then suggests that they're really using capital as more of a metaphor than in any kind of literal sense. Because if it was literal, it would have to actually adhere to the stock flow distinction, which it clearly doesn't.
Right, but and this is where like the way I teach, I'm going to take it to the networks separate from capital for a moment, is like the way that we typically talk about networks as mattering, thinks about kind of network structure as one of two things. It's the conduit through which things pass, or it is the structure that is itself somehow differentiating like position or role or social status in a system and those sorts of things. And so I would argue that in some ways that the kind of network corollary is useful in the capital sense in the same way there is that some of those, and that's why I think this kind of notion of kind of accessibility versus kind of adhering in the relations is the differentiation for me that allows for both of those to work. Just differentiating kind of the forms of them along star dimensions allows for that difference rather than thinking about them as either necessarily the same or incompatible with one another, which I think is the current kind of concern with things that are allowing for both of those. So that'd be my kind of gut reaction to that.
Yeah, and as Michael Woolcock described it as the analogy of the electricity wires compared to the actual electricity traveling along those wires. And clearly, for electricity to flow, you need both of those things. And so you can quibble and argue about whether it's the wires or it's the electricity, but ultimately you actually need to take both of them into account, which is, I think, kind of the strength of what you're talking about with the multidimensionality of what you're talking about is you can't really just focus on one and ignore the others, because for the outcome to occur, you need to take into account all of it.
I would agree.
Yeah. So just as a side, I've shared the link to the Lyndon Robertson's and co-authors paper on Is Social Capital Really Capital back from 2002. And I'm currently working with Professor Robertson on a follow-up to that, which is going to be called Yes, Social Capital is Capital. And
I think I know of 3 different papers that have some variant of that title for what it's worth. Right. I don't think there's so.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what we're doing is we're showing that there can be a principled boundary between the stock and the flow. And when it's understood in that way, then it really is a form of capital and not simply a metaphor for it. So that we're working on that currently, and that's going to be hopefully coming out early next year.
Excellent.
So a question did just pop up in the chat. This will be the last one. The question is, how might the framework's 3 dimensions, resource position, structural advantage, reward accrual, interact to explain why some organizations successfully transfer tacit knowledge while others fail?
This is one of the times where I actually do have, I think, a relatively concrete answer. Is I think this is a good example of, the kind of what organizational theorists often refer to as kind of patterns of isomorphism. Is I would argue that what often happens in that case is organization that is being copied from is observed as being similar to the organization that's doing the copying on 1 or 2 of these. And we're not paying attention to the way it differs on the other one. And as a result, the kind of carryover is unsuccessful because of that missing or unobserved variation, right? So this is the classic version of like what gets referred to as mimetic isomorphism, is we copy things without kind of recognizing what the constraints were that led to the successful outcome. So I would say that it's probably, or at least potentially, I shouldn't say probably, I should say at least potentially, because of dissimilarity on some ignored dimension, either that we're highlighting or maybe one that we've missed, but also should be considered.
Yeah, great. Well, let's wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Jimmy, for your time and effort in presenting this webinar. As I said, I think this is critically important for the social capital field, and I hope everyone engages with the work that you're doing.
Appreciate it.
So we've got a great series of webinars coming up in the next few weeks. The next one is going to be titled Building Social Capital by Design. That's on Wednesday next week, and it's more of a practical look and focus on how we can build social capital in practice. And we've got lots of other great webinars as well, so check out the details on our website. And of course, one final plug for our conference next year in Dubai. In March, we've got Professor Bob Putnam as well as Raj Chetty and Beata Volker as our keynotes. And I think we've had 435 abstracts submitted by by now. So it's going to be a huge event. Really looking forward to that, and details are available also through the association website. So thanks, everyone. I'll stop the recording. Feel free to stay online if you want to, just for a little bit of informal discussion and a bit of connections as well.